Morning, church. It's good to see everyone. Hey, if you're a visitor with us, we're glad you're here to worship. Today we're launching a brand new series called Jesus Is. And the past month or so, we've been talking about the village, what it means to be a village, what it means for a group of people to unite around this cause that for us is Jesus. And so, naturally coming out of that, asking the question, well, who is he? I mean, if we're united around this cause of Jesus and working together as a village, what and who is Jesus? And probably all of us, if we were to fill in that blank, Jesus is based on maybe our past, maybe the home we grew up in, maybe the church that we grew up going to or not going to, maybe based on our family, all of these different circumstances, we would probably all answer that question a little bit different. Some of our answers might sound a little bit the same, but if you were to fill in the blank, Jesus is, it would probably sound different all the way across the room. And so over the next month or so, we're going to fill in that blank a little bit together. This morning, I want to pray, and then we're going to jump right in. Father, we're thankful for this morning. God, we're thankful for the church, village. God, we're thankful for the time that we get to be together with one another, but yet also with you. And I pray that as we spend time in worship, God, that we also now will spend time in learning who you are and what you desire of our lives. And Father, I pray that we'll get out of your way today, that we'll not spend time telling you who we are, but we will take time learning who you are. Lord, we are thankful for your grace. It's in your name we pray. Amen. How many of you have a boss at work? Raise your hand. Boss at work. All right. How many of you have a boss at home? Great men. Long rides home. Most of us, at one time or another, we have worked under the authority of someone. If nothing else, you were a child at one time, and so your life operated under the authority of your parent, okay? Most of you, just by show of hands, have bosses at work. Some of you have bosses at home. And we won't name names or point fingers. But we have worked under that set of authority. Their rules, we have done what they have wanted. A little bit old school here, but a compass. A compass, okay, tells us a direction in which we're to go. Okay, modern day compass does not look like this. Modern day compass looks like an app on your phone called Google Maps. Modern day compass looks like maps on Google that you pull up. And so if you're going to a destination, a modern day compass is you type the destination into your phone, and then it brings up a bunch of directions of where to go, when to turn, when not to turn, what street to go on, what street not to turn on. And maybe you have a GPS unit in your vehicle, and so you just type it in, and then this voice talks to you the whole time you're on your trip, so you don't feel alone. That's very encouraging. But maybe that's the place where you find direction. So some of us have worked under bosses, under authority. And some of us, when we go on a trip, we find our destination via the directions that we have been given. All of these resources right here, they sit on bookshelves in my office. And I would like to tell you that I am very astute and have read every one of these books, okay? I would love to tell you that, but I'd be lying. We're in church, so we're not going to do that. Okay? And so, but all of these books, all these resources, DVDs over here, they all cover one topic. Okay? They cover the topic that has to do with authority and following authority. And they have to do with topics that have to do with direction and which way to go. All of these books that sit on my shelf have to do with one thing: leadership. Leadership. And this morning, if we were to start, and where we're going to start this series, looking and answering this question, who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Jesus is, fill in the blank. I would argue that one of the best places to start is Jesus is leader. In my life, I've read some of these books. I've looked at some of these resources. And probably if I were to pick out one book out of all of this that I have learned the most about leadership, I would have to look through the titles, and my answer, probably of all the books on the table that I've learned the most about leadership from, it's this one. It's this one. Because here's the deal. I don't know about you, but I'm an example type person. I can read lots of facts, and I can pull some information there. But if I have an example to go by, I'm a whole lot better off. And so when I look at this, I get to see an example. An example of someone who's already done it. An example of someone who has already lived it. And so this morning, as we answer this question together of Jesus is, this morning we're going to fill in that blank with leader. I want to invite you to look at an example that Jesus lived out in John chapter 13. In John chapter 13, if you brought a Bible, go ahead and turn there. It'll be on the screen. You can look at it on your phone. In John chapter 13, Jesus, he is sitting down with his disciples. In John chapter 13, we're nearing the end of Jesus' life. And so he's been together with these guys for quite a while, 3 years almost. John chapter 13, beginning verse 1. It says, it was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. And Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that had been wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. And Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you will have no part. And then Lord, Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Jesus answered, a person who has a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him. And that was why he said, not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do that. It's something that was commonplace during this culture. When you would walk into someone's house, there was normally a slave who was there at the door, who would meet you, who would clean your feet before you walked into the person's house. Reason being is because at best, you would wear sandals during this time period. At best. Okay? And so if you weren't wearing sandals, most likely you were just walking around barefoot. Now, you're walking around on dirt roads that animals have walked on time and time again, so you have no idea what you're walking on at times or stepping in. Okay? And so you can imagine the condition of their feet. I mean, they're just constantly in dust and dirt and all sorts of stuff. And so they step into the door, and typically there was a slave there that would scrub their dirty, nasty feet. Then they would walk into the house. So as not to be rude to the person who was inviting them in, they would clean their feet before walking in. It's almost like nowadays, you walk in with snow in your shoes and you try to dust it off, or maybe you take your shoes off so that way you don't get snow and dirt and everything in someone's house. Same type of idea, but a lot more gross. And so they would scrub their feet and they'd get all this stuff off. Then they walk in. Well, as Jesus sits down with the disciples, that didn't happen that day. For whatever reason, there was no one that cleaned their feet. And so their feet, they're sitting at this table, and their feet are still filthy and dirty, which was the role of the slave. Now we learn, when we look at the whole story of what's taking place in a couple of the other Gospels, we learn that as they sit down around this table to eat, the disciples begin to argue about who is the most important. And so you have all of these conflicting ideas of, well, I'm the best. No, I'm the best. No, it's really me. And so the disciples, they're bickering and they're arguing about who's best and who gets to sit next to Jesus. No, I get to sit next to Jesus. I mean, I preached the longest the other day. I'm the best disciple, so I get to sit next to Jesus. And so there's this bickering and there's this arguing, and Jesus just kind of hanging out He's sitting and he's watching. So that when it says they reclined at the table, literally, they didn't sit down at the kitchen table or dining table like we do. They would sit down, and the table was very low to the ground, and they would sit and they would almost lay on one hip and rest their arm, and they would eat and share their meal like that. They would literally recline at the table. And so they finally sit down. Everyone finds their spot. They're in the middle of the meal, and Jesus looks around and he sees how filthy everyone's feet is. Now Jesus, remember, Jesus is the leader. He's more or less the top dog, and all the disciples learn underneath him. And Jesus stands up, and he's the one, he walks over, and he picks up a basin, and he pours water into it. And then he even describes how he even took on the clothing of a slave, just the loincloth, and he tucked a towel in his waist, and he picked it up. Now it's not supposed to happen this way. I mean, the CEO doesn't wash feet. The president of the company, he doesn't wash feet. I mean, there's all of these guys around this table. They should be in line before Jesus to wash his feet, right? Because that's what a leader does, correct? I mean, a leader is up top and everyone else is below. Until you begin to follow Jesus. Jesus takes that bottle and he flips it upside down. He says, whoever wants to be first will be last. And Jesus walks over and he picks up this towel and he picks up this basin of water and he begins to lean down and he starts to scrub their feet. He begins to wash the dirt and all sorts of stuff off their feet. He begins to move around the table. And he gets to Peter. You remember Peter? I mean, we get the full story, so it's the same Peter. It's the same Peter that here in just a little bit, after Jesus dies and goes into heaven, it's the same Peter that's going to stand before a crowd of people and preach and start the church. It's that Peter. It's the Peter that Jesus called from the Sea of Galilee to drop his net and come follow him. And so he did. It's the same Peter. It's the same Peter that here, real shortly, is going to deny that he even knows Jesus to a group of people. It's the same Peter. And Peter looks at Jesus and says, you're not going to wash my feet, right? I mean, come on, Jesus. He begins to question what Jesus is doing. And for those of us reading the story thinking, Peter, what are you doing? I mean, quick question. I mean, Jesus knows what he's doing, right? Why would you question that? And we almost, I mean, myself, when I read the story, I think, Peter, get it together, man. Just let him wash your feet. Peter's like, well, I mean, you're not going to wash my feet, are you, Jesus? And he begins to question, begins to wonder what the plan is and ask for more details and wonder why he's doing this. And for those of us reading the story like Peter, just let him wash your feet. I mean, Jesus knows what's best. All the while, Peter's questioning authority. I mean, you're not going to do this to me, are you? Are you, Jesus? And while looking in the story, we think, Peter, get it together. I think most of us, if we were to find our place around the table, we would sit right where Peter sits. Because all the while, Jesus is coming to us. He's saying, hey, I just want to wash your feet. Peter, who has spent years with Jesus, alongside of him, learning from him, watching him, following his example, still, right now, is questioning what he's going to do, which I think probably describes a lot of us in the room. We've been coming to church for years. We've been sitting listening to sermons for maybe years. And we've read the information in the Bible. We see how Jesus is leader, but yet we're still sitting and saying, Jesus, you're really going to do this? Wait a minute, what? Now, I mean, Jesus, I know you want to forgive me for this, but I can't. Jesus, you really want to give me joy? I mean, look at the condition of life right now. Look at my circumstances. You can't do that. Jesus, you really want me to serve? You want me to give up that time? I mean, my schedule's already booked. I can't do that. I mean, wait a minute, Jesus, what are you doing? And while Peter, it seems to look a little bit ridiculous in the story, I think most of us would sit in his seat. And although we know who Jesus is, we question when he wants to do something through us. Jesus says, yeah, Peter, I'm going to wash your feet. You don't understand it right this minute. And what's Peter's next response? No. No. Parents in the room, how many of you remember maybe one of the first times that your child told you no? Was that the most joyous experience of your life? Did you write that one down in the baby book? On this day, they told me no for the first time. Oh. No, it was frustrating. Okay, you want to pull your hair out. But Reagan right now, she's in a stage where she is very well versed in the word no. And there are Reagan, bring your clothes upstairs. No, I want to. Or Reagan, put your plate in the sink. No, I don't want. Or Reagan, it's time to go to bed. No, I don't want. And no. I'm like, yes! Just pulling my hair, what? There's no hair to pull out, but, I'm frustrated, okay? When our child tells us no, it's like, well, yes! Don't tell me no. I know, every time I've said that this past week, don't tell me no. As parents, we understand the frustration of that, if you've been there. We understand, hey, I just want you to do this because it's what's best. Just go and just do what I'm asking you to do. No, I don't want to. You know that tension. You know that frustration. So can you imagine how Jesus feels when we play the role as the child? And much like Peter, he says, listen, I really want you to do this. No, Jesus, I can't. I really want you to go get to know your neighbor a little bit and possibly show them Jesus. No, I can't. I really want you to love that coworker at work that everyone else talks about on lunch break. No, Jesus, I can't. I would rather. I would really like you to sacrifice a little bit to give to someone else. No, Jesus, I can't. And while we understand the frustration and the tension as parents with a child when they tell us no, we are the child. So many times when it comes to Jesus. And we're like Peter. No, I don't want to. I would rather. Jesus looks at Peter and says, listen, if I don't wash your feet, there's going to be a distance between us. Peter's like, well, if that's the case, then wash my hands, wash my feet, wash my head. Take care of it all. Whatever we got to do, I don't want that separation. And so Jesus washes his feet and finishes around the table. And then he finds his spot and he sits back down at the table. He looks at the guys sitting around the table, knowing that his life is about to end. And he says, guys, do you know why I did this? Do you know why I did this? And I imagine there was either some blank stares of, I don't know, I don't want to be wrong, or, yeah, I know why, and then they just spout out the wrong answer. He just says, listen, I did this to set an example for you. I did this to set an example for you. And although you don't realize it right now, and although you don't understand all this right now, because remember, we get the full picture. The disciples, they're right there in the moment. They don't know that Jesus is about to die here in just a little bit. He says, listen, you don't understand right now, but I'm setting an example for you to repeat. In other words, I'm being a leader. I am leading you in what is ahead. And through leadership, I'm setting an example. The greatest lesson that I've ever learned from Jesus is this. When Jesus is the leader, I am not. End of story. There's nothing deeper. When Jesus is the leader, I am not. When Jesus sets the example, I follow the example. I don't set the example. When Jesus is the leader, I am not. You see, Jesus' model of leadership is do as I do, not do as I say. And so we follow his example. And his example in leadership is, listen, sometimes it takes us getting our hands dirty to love others and to serve others. Sometimes it takes us setting an example for other people to really see who I am. About 5 years ago, right before Emily and I moved up here from Joplin, after graduation, I worked in the Joplin Juvenile Detention Center. And part of my job was when teenagers were arrested and then brought into the detention center, it was my job to check them in. And normally that process was a little bit rough because being arrested, then being brought more or less to teenage jail, being brought to the detention center, they're not the most happy individuals at that moment in life. They're not cheery, they're not filled with jokes and smiles. They're brought into the room, they're sat down, and they're mad. They're frustrated. And so sometimes, the questions, they weren't difficult, like, what's your name? And then they would tell you your name, and you begin this process of checking them in to the detention center. Normally there's a police officer who would wait there until we're brought back to their room. Sometimes teenagers would come in and they were mad enough they didn't want to answer your questions. And so eventually after trying, he'd say, listen, you can either answer the questions now, or you can go sit down, calm down, and then come back and answer the questions. I remember there was this one 12-year-old boy. He came in literally just a fit of rage. I mean, he walked in and you could hear him coming through the front door. He wasn't even into the room yet. And he was yelling and just a fit of rage. And he was calling the police officer every name that you could think of. They bring him in, they sit him down, and he's just mad. He spits on the floor. I mean, just a terrible situation, just furious at life. I said, I always introduce myself. My name's Matt. Can you tell me your name? No! Okay. So, can you tell me your birthday? I don't wanna. Okay. I mean, the questions never got more difficult than that. Do you know why you're here? No! All right. Do you know your name yet? No! Okay, all right, let's get do it. And so, this would just continue and this kitty, I finally said, listen, these questions aren't going to get more difficult, but if you can't answer them, I'm going to have you go and sit down and hang out for a little bit and then come back when you're calmed down. Whatever. And so then myself and the police officer, we begin to bring him back. And at that moment, he was so frustrated, so upset. He thought that his best option was to fight us. That didn't work out too well for him. Police officer was much bigger than me, and I'm not small. And he was 12. And so it just didn't end well for him at all. And so he was brought back to his room, and he was sat down. And a couple hours later, I went and got him. Ready to answer my questions now? Yeah. We came out and we answered our questions. Over the next couple days, I got to know him just a little bit, during free time, things like that. Just talking to him, and I asked him, and I asked almost all the teenagers in there at one time, what got you here? Or why is it that you're acting like this? And almost all the time, I would give almost the same exact answer, maybe twisted a little bit different. They would start talking about their family, and eventually they would look at me and they would say, honestly, I've never seen anything different. I've never seen anything different. Which means that they were just following the example that they saw. And if I were to venture to guess, if we pulled society outside of these walls right now and asked them, hey, why don't you follow Jesus? Why don't you give Jesus a shot? Probably, if I were to venture to guess, we would get some sort of answer that has to do with, I've never seen him. Which should put some pressure on us that if we are following Jesus, if he is leader, then we should be following his example, and not just learning his example, but living his example. If Jesus is leader, then we should also be people who pick up a basin and a towel and do the worst of worst things if it requires us to do so in order to look like Jesus. Because if Jesus is leader, we are not. I'm afraid sometimes that we get stuck in this trap where we view Jesus as the liaison and not leader. And what I mean by that is we all want to go to heaven because we don't want to go to hell. And so we use Jesus as this liaison to get there, but really we don't want to live like he does. And so we use Jesus as a liaison to make us feel better about our mistakes and to get us to heaven, but we really don't want to allow him to be leader of our life. And Jesus says, I'm doing this to set an example for you to do when I leave. When Jesus is leader, we are not. We are not. Every Wednesday here at church, in the morning, one of the first things that happens every Wednesday is that Tri-County Christian School, they come up here to the church and they do chapel. And the older kids come in first, and then eventually the preschool and daycare, they come in. And there is a phrase that I hear almost every single Wednesday from one of the teachers at some point. I hear them come in, they do their chapel service, and then it's time to leave. And almost every class has a designated leader. That's their job for the day or their job for the week. And so that person stands in front. And then the teacher, and this especially happens with the younger kids, but it happens with all of them. But the designated leader of the class, that student, goes in front, right behind the teacher. The teacher then lines everybody else up behind them, getting ready to leave the building. And the teacher then walks to the front of the line and turns around, looks at the class. They're all in a straight line. She says, all right, let's go. The front person starts moving, and then here's what happened to the straight line. And it just like bleeds into this mass. And she turns around and says, get back in line, get back in line. So everyone scurries and gets back in line. So get back in line. The teacher walks to the front and says, all right, here we go. They start to walk, and in like a foot and a half, it's just blue. It's just like this blob that just becomes. I mean, this happens with the middle schoolers too, don't get me wrong, but most of the time you see it with the preschoolers. And there's this phrase that I hear almost every single week from one teacher or another. And as this blob happens, everyone just kind of moves to the destination or begins to move out and do whatever they want. And then I hear the teacher, get back in line, there's only one leader. There's only one leader. Oh, yeah. Okay. Everyone gets back in line. All right, let's go. Everything just begins to separate. Turns around. Get back in line. There's only one leader. Okay. Get back in line. I mean, by this point, they're only to the third pew. I mean, it's a slow process. If I were to picture something that could depict what at times my relationship with Jesus has looked like, it would be that group of preschoolers lining up. There's only one leader. Okay. There's only one leader, Matt. Okay. I'm back in line. Sorry. All right, it's time to go. All right, Jesus, I'm ready to go. All right, Matt, I want you to follow me, and I want you to give up your time and serve. Okay, Jesus. There's only one leader, Matt. Okay, sorry. Matt, I want you to sacrifice it. I want you to give. Look, I've called you to give. Okay, Jesus. All right. There's only one leader, Matt. Okay, sorry. Following you. Right here, Jesus. I want you to love your kids the way that I love you, Matt. I want you to extend grace to them. And patience. Okay, Jesus. Follow me. There's only one leader, Matt. There's only one leader. Okay. Matt, I want you to love and lead the church and make it the very best that you can. Okay. Sorry, Jesus. I'm going to lead now. There's only one leader, Matt. Okay, sorry. I think that probably all of us in the room, as Jesus picks up a basin of water and a towel and flips the leadership model like upside down. He looks at the disciples and says, there's only one man. Follow my example. There's some of us in the room, and we can relate to Peter. We can relate to Peter. We know who Jesus is. We know the information about Jesus. But we're arguing with him for what's best in life. There's others of us that we're trying our best to follow. But although we're claiming we're following Jesus, we're just doing life how we want. And we come back to church on Sunday. There's only one Jesus. Okay, sorry. I'm back. And there's something that happens in life that we don't like, and we step in front of Jesus, and we begin to tell him how we're going to live and what we're going to do. And as Jesus says, with a basin and a towel in his hand, there's only one leader. Who is Jesus? Jesus is the leader of our lives. And if Jesus is leader, we are not. Let's pray. Jesus, as you sat before a group of disciples, you set an example of leadership that is unlike anything in society. It's not a dictator. It's not a ruler. Jesus, it wasn't based on authority and power. It was based on humility and love and an example. And as you washed the feet of the disciples, you showed us that leadership is not built on the things that the world builds it on. It's based and built on who you are. You called your disciples to follow you and to follow your example. And that's still true for us right now. Jesus, all of us in the room, we have a different picture of what you look like and who you are. Circumstances have painted different ideas into our head. But I pray this morning that before we understand anything else, that we accept that you are the leader of life, that you are the one who's out in front. And Jesus, I pray this morning for those of us who can relate and find ourselves sitting in the seat of Peter. And although we know who you are, we're still arguing with you about what's best. And God, I pray for others of us. I pray for others of us in the room that we relate to Peter on a different side. Or we're not questioning you. We're telling you no. No, I don't want to. Because we might feel uncomfortable. Because we might not understand completely. Because we might not have all the answers. Jesus, I pray this morning for those of us that we know that you're the leader, but we're walking whatever way we want, and we're not standing in line. Or maybe some of us this morning that we know there's only one leader, and right now we view it as us and not you. And Jesus, no matter where we're at in this story, I pray today that your Spirit will move the same way that it did in that room as you washed people's feet. I pray that your Spirit moves in this room, and that we will be humbled by your leadership. And that we will be willing to give up everything and anything, because when you're leader, we're not. When you're in charge, we're not. When you're out in front, we're not. And so, God, I pray that we give up our pride, and I pray that we give up our arrogance, God, and we step in line and follow you, because there is only one leader. God, while many of us try to follow all of these things in life that get us nowhere, I pray today is the day that we turn around and we follow you. That you will be the leader in our lives, and that we will not. Jesus, I'm thankful that we have your word, and that we get to see your example. We get to see it played out, lived out, of what it means for us to follow